You won't believe how weird Hitler, the man who controlled millions, was terrified of germs, obsessed with routines, and constantly afraid of being poisoned. This is Adolf Hitler, but not the version you've seen before. Behind the speeches, the power, and a carefully constructed image was a private world filled with paranoia, strange habits, and behavior that feels almost unreal. And here's what makes it disturbing. These weren't just quirks. They influenced decisions that shaped the course of history. So the real question isn't how strange he was. It's how someone like this was able to rise to absolute power. Let's start peeling back the image you've always seen. The stiff posture, the controlled voice, the almost mechanical presence of Adolf Hitler. Because that version, it was carefully constructed. What existed behind closed doors was far more unpredictable and far more disturbing. Hitler was obsessed with control, but not just politically. His daily life was ruled by rigid, almost compulsive routines. He would eat at the exact same time every day, often the same meals, prepared in a very specific way. And here's where it gets strange. He was famously vegetarian, not out of modern ethical beliefs, but due to a mix of health paranoia and personal fixation. He feared being poisoned constantly, which meant his food was tested before he even touched it. But it didn't stop there. He had an intense fear of germs. People who worked closely with him noted that he was deeply uncomfortable with physical contact. Handshakes were brief, controlled, almost rehearsed. He would frequently wash his hands and avoid close proximity unless absolutely necessary. This wasn't just caution, it bordered on obsession. Now imagine this. The man commanding one of the most aggressive military regimes in history couldn't tolerate someone standing too close to him. And then there were his sleeping habits. Hitler rarely slept like a normal person. He stayed up extremely late, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, watching films, having long monologues, or discussing ideas with his inner circle. These weren't conversations in the traditional sense. They were one-sided, almost theatrical speeches where others were expected to listen, not respond. His day would then begin late in the afternoon, completely out of sync with the typical structure of leadership. This created a strange dynamic inside Nazi Germany. Decisions affecting millions were often being made at night in isolated environments, shaped by a leader who was physically and mentally detached from normal rhythms. But perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects was his dependency on medication. Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell, administered a shocking cocktail of drugs. Everything from stimulants to sedatives, vitamins, and even substances that today would be considered dangerous or addictive. Over time, Hitler became increasingly reliant on these injections to function. His mood swings, bursts of energy, and sudden crashes weren't just personality traits. They were chemically influenced. Think about that for a second. A man making decisions that would impact the entire world was often under the influence of powerful substances, prescribed without modern medical oversight. And yet, despite all of this, despite the paranoia, the rigid habits, the late nights, the dependency, he maintained an image of absolute authority. Publicly, he appeared disciplined, focused, almost superhuman in control. Privately, it was a completely different story. There are accounts describing his emotional instability, moments of explosive anger followed by deep withdrawal. He could go from dominating a room with intense energy to isolating himself for hours, avoiding even his closest associates. This unpredictability made those around him cautious, even fearful, not just of his power, but of his behavior. And then there's the contradiction that's hardest to ignore. Hitler presented himself as a symbol of strength, purity, and order. But his personal world was chaotic, filled with anxieties, obsessions, and dependencies that directly conflicted with the image he projected. It's this gap between the public persona and the private reality that makes his story so unsettling, because it forces a deeper question: how much of history is shaped not just by ideology, but by the personal quirks, fears, and psychological patterns of the individuals in power? When you look closely, these weird traits aren't just random details. They form a pattern, a glimpse into a mind that was deeply controlled on the outside, but increasingly unstable underneath. And the more you uncover, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a story about power. It was a story about a man whose inner world was far stranger and far more influential than anyone realized. As the war dragged on, the gap between the image and the reality of Adolf Hitler became impossible to ignore. What once looked like absolute control began to fracture, slowly at first, then all at once. Inside the bunker during the final months of World War II, everything intensified. The routines became even more rigid, the paranoia deeper, the isolation almost complete. Hitler wasn't just leading a collapsing regime. He was retreating into a world that revolved entirely around his own perceptions. Reports from the front lines were filtered, softened, sometimes even altered, because those around him feared how he would react to the truth. And when reality did break through, it didn't lead to clarity. It led to denial. He began making decisions that ignored basic military logic, ordering troops to hold positions that were already lost, refusing strategic retreats, and insisting on outcomes that were no longer possible. To the outside world, it looked like stubbornness, but inside that bunker, it felt more like detachment from reality itself. This is where the weirdness stops being strange and starts becoming dangerous. Because those personal traits, the need for control, the fear, the rigid thinking, the dependency on medication, all of it now had direct consequences, not just for him, but for millions of people still caught in the chaos of World War II. There are eyewitness accounts describing his physical state during this time. His hands trembling, his posture deteriorating, his once commanding presence reduced to something fragile and unpredictable. Some historians even suggest symptoms consistent with neurological conditions, possibly worsened by the substances given by Theodore Morell. Whether it was illness, addiction, or sheer psychological collapse, the result was the same. A leader who once thrived on control was losing it. And yet, even in those final days, the illusion never fully disappeared. Orders were still being given. Plans were still being drawn. There was still this insistence, almost delusional, that things could turn around. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was belief, disconnected from reality. Then came the end. In April 1945, as enemy forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler made his final decision. Inside that underground bunker, cut off from the world he once dominated, he chose to end his own life. It was abrupt, but in many ways, it was the only ending that aligned with everything we've seen control until the very last moment. But here's the part that lingers. When we look back at figures like Hitler, it's easy to focus only on the scale, the war, the destruction, the undeniable impact on history. But when you zoom in, when you really examine the details, you start to see something far more unsettling, not just a dictator, but a deeply flawed, deeply complex individual whose personal behaviors, fears, and obsessions didn't stay private. They shaped decisions. They influenced outcomes. They altered the course of history in ways that still echo today. And that raises a question that's uncomfortable, but important. If someone like this could rise to power, maintain it, and reshape the world, how much do we really understand about the people we choose to follow? Because history isn't just built on events, it's built on individuals. And sometimes the most dangerous things about those individuals aren't the parts we see on the surface. They're the parts we don't. If this changed the way you see history, then you're only scratching the surface. Because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're warnings, patterns, and truths hiding in plain sight. So if you want more deep, unsettling, and eye-opening breakdowns of history's most powerful figures, the parts they never taught you, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the deeper you go into history, the more you realize. It's not just about what happened, it's about why it happened, and who was really behind it.